There were no such things as credit cards in those days, or any of the other present sophisticated forms of consumer credit. And the massive growth of these mechanisms have far exceeded the relatively crude and limited lines of credit available to the small numbers of people who invested in the stock market and the real estate market in the 20s. The rubber band has been stretched much further this time around, and the ultimate snapback will certainly be more severe. In 1929, it was an overextended stock market that collapsed and caused panic at the banks. This time, it probably will be the other way around. It likely will be an overextended banking system that will cause panic at the stock market and all the other markets as well. Now let's examine how this situation has come to pass. It's sometimes called the ticking debt bomb. I call it the giant Ponzi scheme. There's a great deal of talk about the so-called debt bomb ticking away in the banking system, with particular reference to these massive loans made by many of the larger banks to communist and underdeveloped nations. Now let's analyze what this is and how it has come about. First of all, the Federal Reserve System has flooded the banks with newly created fiat money, as we have seen. What this causes is that the larger banks, which, as we know, are protected from failure by government, now have this money on their hands, and they prowl the world, seeking underdeveloped countries to accept loans so that they can collect their interest, or more correctly called royalty. Well, the heads of these governments are more than happy to accept the money, and with it they launch gigantic socialist projects to enhance their political power. Now, these projects supposedly are going to earn their own way when completed, but because they are socialistic schemes, of course, they never do. They almost always result in gigantic cost overruns and operating losses, which must be paid by the already impoverished citizens of those countries. And so the next step in this development is for the banks to agree to increase the size of the original loan in order to fund the cost overruns or to expand the projects, which supposedly will now allow it to operate on a self-sufficient basis. Now, when the governments come to that inevitable point where they cannot repay their loans, then the banks step in and grant them an extension and agree to what they call a rollover, which means that the term of the loan is extended for another 6 or 9 months, provided only that the government agrees to continue paying the royalty or interest on the loan. Now remember, the royalty is all that the bank really cares about, because if the country actually paid back the debt, the bank would only have to go out and find some other government or large corporation to accept an equal loan to replace it. You see, if you don't have borrowers, you can't collect royalties, and then you go out of business. That's the essence of banking. You must have borrowers, and so you don't really want these loans to be repaid. The money came out of the inkwell in the first place, and when the loan is repaid, it disappears back into the well, where it is of no use to the bankers at all. So they don't really want the loans repaid so long as the borrower continues sending in the interest, or the royalty. And so eventually, the loans are rolled over and expanded, and this is done so many times that the socialist governments come to the point where they cannot even continue to pay the royalty, and then they threaten default. At this point, the banks begin to face a serious problem. They must not have their borrowers default on their loans, especially loans of that size. Now, it isn't that they would lose anything if they did, because they wouldn't. Remember, they created that money out of nothing, and therefore nothing is exactly what they would lose. But they must avoid default for other reasons. One reason is that default means a stop to their royalty payments, which of course is their lifeblood. The other reason is that if a borrower defaults, then the bank is required to show the amount of that default on its public financial statement as a non-performing loan, or if there's no hope of reviving it, as an outright loss. Now, if this happens, then the true nature of the bank's financial condition is revealed for all to see. When loans of this size, which one day are carried on the books as assets, suddenly are moved across the page and listed as liabilities or losses, the bank becomes, in terms of normal accounting concepts, bankrupt. Its liabilities and losses greatly exceed its assets, and the trend shows that the condition will probably continue. Now, this quite naturally will cause the public to question the stability of that bank and its worthiness to continue acting as the guardian of their funds. Investors will divest themselves of the bank's stocks, causing the value of those shares to plummet on the market. And especially depositors will rush to transfer their deposits to more secure havens. In other words, there will be a run on the bank, one of the cabal's most dreaded events. Now, as an aside, it's important to realize that most of what is being discussed here in terms of communist and underdeveloped countries also applies to many of the nation's largest corporations, which are now so deeply in debt that no one really seriously expects them to repay those debts. So what does the bank do then, finally, to prevent a default? It loans the country the money it needs to pay the interest. Incredible as that may seem, that is exactly what has been happening now for well over a decade. Furthermore, the country is not interested in borrowing more money and incurring even higher interest obligations merely to be able to pay interest back to the banks. No, the only way that they're willing to do that is if the banks also increase the size of the principal of the loan so that the politicians can have more money to further enhance their popularity and consolidate their political power, not to mention the lining of their own personal pockets. And so we aren't just loaning money to these countries to pay back the interest, but we must increase the size of the capital part of the loan also in order to make it attractive to the political component of the partnership. Well, the next step in this incredible game is for the United States Treasury and the International Monetary Fund to step into the picture and to supply U.S. tax dollars to the indebted countries, supposedly as loans, but which everyone knows will never be repaid, in order for those countries to continue paying royalties to the banks a little while longer. And by the time this stage is reached, and it was reached several years ago, the end is near, and everyone playing the game knows it. No one can tell how long this final stage can be prolonged, but of one thing we can be certain: it cannot continue indefinitely. When the process finally comes to a halt, it will bring disastrous consequences to someone. Now, what is happening today is merely the maneuvering of forces to determine who that someone is going to be. And it's with that question in mind that we turn now away from the past and the present and take a cautious but hard glimpse into the future. What lies ahead? That's a question that everyone asks. Obviously, no one can answer for certain, not even the cabal. But I think I can make a pretty good guess. I believe that the future will follow one of three possible scenarios: an optimistic scenario, a pessimistic scenario, or a realistic one. Now let's take a look at the optimistic scenario first. In order for an optimistic scenario to unfold, I think everyone would agree we would have to have certain reforms enacted very quickly. So quickly, in fact, that it would be in time to avert a crisis. Now, what would those reforms be? I see four of them at least. First, we would have to repeal the legal tender laws, perhaps the most fundamental of all reforms, because without these legal tender laws, we would be able to escape the burden of fiat money simply by refusing to accept it and using instead gold coins, other currencies which are backed by gold, books of tickets to Disneyland, or anything else of real value that we choose to use. But as long as we have legal tender laws on the books, we are forced by law to use fiat money. Those laws must be repealed. The second reform is to abolish central banking. Now, there are several movements afoot today to eliminate the Federal Reserve System. That's good as far as it goes, but it doesn't go far enough. Some of these measures actually merely are talking about turning over the powers of the Federal Reserve System to the Treasury Department or some other agency of the federal government, which wouldn't change things a bit. The Federal Reserve System will not be reformed merely by placing it nominally under the control of the Treasury. Remember, it's in this kind of quasi-government control in most other countries, and it hasn't changed the nature of the central bank mechanism one bit. And if we did that in this country, it still would be a central bank mechanism, and the same people would control it either way. Central banking must be abolished outright. A third reform, a return to the gold standard. To do this, we would first have to define what is a dollar. That would be a very interesting and enlightening experience. First of all, I would suggest that we would audit and assay the government gold supply at Fort Knox and elsewhere. You realize that no one is really quite sure how much gold is there and what the purity is? It needs to be audited and assayed. Then, we should divide the weight of this gold by the number of dollars existing as demand deposits. This will tell us the true value of the dollar in terms of gold. How many paper dollars are out there and demands for paper dollars, and how much gold is there? Now we know the value of the dollar in terms of gold. At current levels, the true value of the dollar, as far as I can determine with current statistics, is about 1/1700th of an ounce of gold. That means, and listen to this carefully, that means that the realistic price of gold should be today about $1,700 per ounce. Interesting, isn't it? All right. The next thing we'd have to do is require 100% gold behind all of our demand deposits. I believe that all banks should be required by law to hold 100% gold reserve behind its M1 money supply. That's the demand deposits. Now, this will make bank runs impossible, and it will greatly stabilize the money supply. Now, I have to admit, for the purists among you, a law really shouldn't be necessary. All we should really have to do is require the banks to honor their contracts, just like any other business. But, ladies and gentlemen, we have become so accustomed to making exceptions for the banking industry that it is now probably quite necessary to legislate a return to honesty and sanity. And finally, we need to abolish the FIDC and the FSLIC. These institutions offer false hope and false security to the American people. Let these financial institutions, the banks and the savings and loan associations, obtain private insurance if they feel there's a need to reassure their depositors. Private insurance could be made available at very reasonable prices. But of course, the insurers would take a hard look at the institutions they were insuring. The weak banks and S&Ls simply wouldn't be able to get insurance. And that would be an excellent way for the public to evaluate those institutions. There are, of course, many other needed reforms, but I'd like to ask you this question. Do you really think that these reforms are going to happen immediately or in the very near future? I'm sorry to say, I do not think they're going to happen. The level of enlightenment and public understanding in these matters today, it just isn't going to happen. Even if they were to happen at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, we would still be in for big trouble. Because the process of monetary destruction already has gone too far. So let's turn to the second view into the future. That is the pessimistic scenario. I'd like to warn you in advance that the scenario I'm about to give you, I do not believe is going to unfold, although it could. But nevertheless, this is a possibility. There could be a trigger event. Any event which causes a run on the banking system, demanding withdrawal of 1% or more of bank deposits, could be that event. Now, that could be a collapse of several large U.S. corporations or savings and loan associations. But more likely, I think, it would be the failure of another major bank in the United States or in Europe or even in Hong Kong. brought about by the default of loans to third world and communist regimes. Because unfortunately, our destiny in America now is intertwined with the rest of the world. The professionals will act first. You see, money market funds are managed by professionals who watch market conditions very closely. They're up at 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning getting the latest reports, and they're on the job while most Americans are sleeping. Now, even though they exude confidence in the system to their clients, most of them are aware of the problem, even more so than you might think. And they will be quick to react to the first sign of a crisis. They will withdraw their funds as quickly as possible, first from the particular bank in trouble, and ultimately out of banks altogether, and probably into Treasury certificates. Money market funds are the largest depositors in banks, so this exodus of deposits will be a catastrophic event. Then we could have the domino effect. A write-down of $4 billion to $5 billion on just one Latin American loan would equal about 10% of the entire net worth of the 171 largest U.S. banks. The publicity given to such an event would be fantastic. The collapse of one major money center bank would lead quickly to the others and to all of the smaller banks that depend on them for their own accounts. Of course, by the time the public catches on, the major action will already have taken place. By the time the public comes to their bank to get their money, there simply will be no money to give. Now, why is that? That's true because there just isn't enough cash. There is not enough cash in the vaults of all the banks to meet the demand of the public. Realize that most money consists only of magnetic impulses in a computer. Of all the money that exists, only about 5% is in coin or currency. And most of that is already outside of the banks, in cash registers, in pocketbooks, and in mattresses. That's where it is, not in the banks. The amount held by the banks is about 1/2%. The amount of currency required to handle a major run on the banks couldn't possibly be produced in time to meet that demand. You see, the Treasury's printing presses already are running 24 hours a day just to keep pace with existing demand. So you can imagine what would happen when the public lines up and they want to convert all of their checkbook money into cash. It simply cannot happen. So what will happen? The FDIC and the FSLIC simply will be paralyzed. The funds behind these organizations can only cover about 1% of their liabilities. Did you know that? All of this talk about your account being insured up to $100,000, don't worry, folks, the government is right behind you. The FDIC and the FSLIC funds can only cover about 1% of their liabilities. In time of crisis, of course, these funds could be legislatively expanded very quickly, which would represent massive inflation, by the way. But that also would take time, and there still wouldn't be enough money printed to supply the demand. And so I think if this unfolds, what we will see then is the declaration of a bank holiday, a nice word for meaning a closing of the banks by government decree, in order to protect the banks, of course. Government and banking spokesmen will assure the public that everything is all right and that the only problem is the irrational behavior of a few alarmists. No one will believe them. Long lines of angry depositors will form at the banks. Bank employees will be threatened. Bomb threats will be made. Violence will break out. Police will be assigned to protect the banks. Possibly even the National Guard will be called up. People will no longer accept checks. Cash will become extremely valuable. Businesses will not be able to borrow money to continue operations. The entire economy will grind to a halt. Finally, the banks will be officially closed for a specific period to allow the cabal time to implement its plan. In this pessimistic scenario, we are assuming that the public is uninformed, and therefore we have to assume that the public will not understand the true causes of the crisis. Those of you who have protected themselves will be resented by the public You will be called hoarders, speculators, and exploiters. Those who tried to warn their friends will be blamed for bringing on the collapse by their lack of faith in the American system. It'll be your fault, you see. Politicians will rise to the challenge and offer sweeping reform of the system, similar to what happened in 1913 when the Federal Reserve System was created, supposedly as reform. I can assure you, ladies and gentlemen, politicians will not sit by and allow the country to slip into a depression, no matter how necessary or short-lived it would be. Because in this pessimistic scenario, in which we assume the public is uninformed, such politicians would be swept out of office. And so we must conclude that the money supply will be greatly expanded by the Federal Reserve System. The purpose will be to flood the economy with new credit, to ease the shortage of money. This process, by the way, already was started before the 1984 elections, and right now is gaining momentum. The FDIC and the FSLIC will be inundated with money. The Federal Reserve System literally will flood the banks and savings and loans with fiat money. It will take several weeks to meet the demand, but eventually, all small depositors will receive currency to cover their withdrawal slips. Money market funds and individuals with deposits over $100,000 will probably not be fully paid, but their numbers will be small, and pleasing the largest numbers of voters will be the name of the game. With money in their pockets at last, most people will perceive that the crisis is over, and bankers and politicians will publicly congratulate each other at the wisdom of their actions. Then what will happen? I believe we will see dishonest accounting become legalized. In 1982, for example, the government allowed the savings and loan industry to conceal the fact that this industry was bankrupt even then by writing off their bad loans and actual losses over a 40-year period, rather than showing the total in the actual year in which they were incurred. Can you imagine that? Writing off a loss over 40 years. Now, this didn't change reality, but it deceived the public and postponed the inevitable distribution of losses. The planners behind this scheme assumed that certainly within 40 years, inflation would have returned like a roaring lion, and these losses would have been washed away through inflation. I believe that a similar device will be used to allow the banks to conceal their condition of bankruptcy by writing off their losses over 30 years or 40 years or 100 years, whatever it takes. Creative accounting of this kind also will not solve the problem completely, but it merely will buy additional time for the cabal to implement its final solution. What is the final solution? That will be to transfer all of the banking losses to the taxpayer. Now remember, the losses are real, and they must eventually be taken by someone. In this pessimistic scenario, I am assuming the public will remain ignorant of the mechanism of central banking, and therefore the cabal will have absolutely no difficulty transferring those losses to the taxpayer. Now, this could be accomplished in three ways. One way would be the outright guarantee of repayment to cover the bank's losses. The second would be to purchase the bad loans by the Treasury or the Federal Reserve. The third way would be to provide something called capital certificates to the banks, which could be converted into money at the time there is a loan default. Now, this capital certificates business has the advantage of being obscure, but it's essentially the same as outright guarantee of the repayment. Now, this has already happened in June of 1985 when the FSLIC issued capital certificates to failing savings and loan associations. And so I believe this will probably be the path that they will follow. Now, somewhere along the line, ladies and gentlemen, a new multicolored U.S. currency will be issued. Now, there currently is a great deal of talk about this supposedly as a means of combating counterfeiters and organized crime. This is camouflage. The cabal which will issue this new currency constitutes the greatest example of counterfeiting and organized crime the world has ever seen. I believe it is likely that the new currency will be issued at the time there is a bank holiday. Now, samples of this money have already been produced, and it's possible, in fact, I think it's even likely, that large quantities of this money are already stored, awaiting just such a contingency. Now, it's true, large amounts of Federal Reserve notes also could be stored for this purpose, but the new money is more likely, in my opinion, because it will serve other purposes as well. And there are 8 definite purposes. Number 1, a smaller quantity will mask inflation. By exchanging 10 or 20 old dollars for one new dollar, a much smaller supply of money will suffice. Now, this will tend to obscure the reality of inflation because each new dollar will be more valuable, or it will be perceived as more valuable than the old. 2, deeper changes in the monetary system can be obscured. I believe there will be a great deal of publicity given to the new money, and the public will be fascinated by the process. All you will be able to see and hear on the radio and the electronic news media is the discussion of the new money. And this will tend to divert attention away from far more important and fundamental changes being made at the same time. 3, the leadership image can be enhanced, because such a dramatic innovation can be offered to the public as evidence that our leaders are really doing something. 4, potential troublemakers will be identified. You see, the government doesn't like individuals to use cash. This allows them to escape many types of surveillance and control, and those who bring in large amounts of cash for exchange will be automatically suspect, and I believe they will be placed into the master computer for future special attention. 5, stem the private international movement of capital. Very important. All bank transactions today are part of a computer record open to government monitoring. This makes it easy to monitor and restrict the movement of funds from one country to another. Now, in the past, even though there are laws to prohibit it, it was easy for individuals to move their money on their persons or by carrier to offshore banking havens or for investment in more secure markets overseas. The new currency is said to have metallic threads embedded in it to trigger security and X-ray devices at airports and other international terminals. And believe me, ladies and gentlemen, they fully intend to put a stop to this kind of international movement of capital. 6, confiscate large cash holdings. Now, it's possible that individuals will have to obtain government authorization to be allowed to exchange large amounts of currency. Those without demonstrable need possibly will lose everything over a modest figure. This has happened in other countries, and it could easily happen here too. 7, clamp down on underground economy. A recent congressional study revealed that about $85 billion in cash is never put into the banks. That represents approximately $1,545 in cash for each household. Tremendous amount. It's also a fact that $100 bills are the fastest growing denomination of currency and already account for almost 1/3 of the value of all currency in circulation. $100 bills. Now, that is not the currency of exchange, that's the currency of hoarding. Now, this is partly due to inflation, but mostly due to private holdings by people who frankly distrust the banks and possibly distrust the government. This fact can be seen very clearly in strike-bound cities. After the paychecks stop coming in, it's not at all unusual for idle workers to be seen making purchases with large denomination bills, mostly 50s and $100 bills. But reason number 8, in my opinion, perhaps is the most important reason to the cabal for bringing out a new currency at this time. And that is because it is a necessary transition to a world currency. The new money will get the public used to the concept of change and also to the loss of traditional American symbols on their money. Now, this is a necessary psychological transition to the acceptance of an international currency, which of course is the ultimate goal. Only with an international currency issued by an international central bank will the cabal be able to control the entire world economy without danger of some countries or some individuals within those countries escaping their influence. So what are the consequences of this pessimistic scenario? There are two major ones. First, we will see hyperinflation. The money supply will grow by the amount of the bailout plus the amount of deficit for welfare, subsidies, and other protectionist measures supposedly offered to cure the effects of previous protectionist measures. This will start as double-digit inflation and rapidly escalate, in my opinion, to over 500%. It could go over 1,000% before the cabal offers its final reform of international currency. And the other consequence will be price, wage, and profit controls imposed, supposedly to stop inflation. Now, this probably will be done by direction of a president who says that he is opposed to the measure. You must remember, most of our wars have been declared by presidents who publicly proclaimed they didn't like war and promised to keep us out of war. Most of our biggest deficit budgets are offered by presidents who came into office claiming that they would put an end to budget deficits. And you must remember that in 1971, President Nixon, who said he hated price controls, was the first president to introduce price controls when inflation reached the, quote, intolerable, end quote, level of 4%. So in short, the bailout will not eliminate the losses. The bailout will merely transfer those losses and multiply them in the process from the communist and third world countries and from the owners of the banks to the American tax-paying middle class. It will wipe out all their savings, their insurance funds, and most of the equity positions in their homes and businesses. History teaches that hyperinflation is fertile ground for seeds of violent revolution. Despair led people to grasp at the promises of Lenin in Russia, Hitler in Germany, and Mao Zedong in China. The pattern continues today in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The United States is not immune. In this country, the desperate and uninformed will be attracted to the revolutionary rhetoric of communism, believing that their woes were caused by a decadent capitalist system. There will be terrorism and revolutionary insurgency. But in my opinion, ladies and gentlemen, these movements will not succeed in overthrowing the government. The primary effect will be to frighten the American people into accepting totalitarian measures supposedly to quell the revolution. This also will allow the cabal to appear moderate in its ultimate destruction of our constitutional rights. Increased government regulations, supposedly to restore public order and economic stability, will become a way of life. There will be no opportunity for citizen protest or opposition. Americans will learn that one cannot have political or personal freedom without economic freedom, and we will have lost both. Now, what lies at the end of that road? I believe it was clearly envisioned by George Orwell in his book 1984. In my opinion, only the date was in error with that book. He foresaw collectivization of the masses, thought control, the impossibility of rebellion, and an ultra-elite directing a so-called stable society. The Rothschild formula was the primary method of control, according to Orwell: war and the threat of war. The world was divided into three hostile regions. He called them Oceania, Eurasia, and East Asia. Orwell explains with these words, quote, "Actually, the three philosophies are barely distinguishable, and the social systems which they support are not distinguishable at all. Everywhere there is the same pyramidal structure, the same worship of a semi-divine leader, the same economy existing by and for continuous warfare. It follows that the three superstates not only cannot conquer one another, but would gain no advantage by doing so. On the contrary, so long as they remain in conflict, they prop up one another like three sheaves of corn. And as usual, the ruling groups of all three powers are simultaneously aware and unaware of what they're doing. Their lives are dedicated to world conquest, but they also know that it is necessary that the war should continue everlastingly and without victory. War, it will be seen, is now a purely internal affair. In the past, the ruling groups of all countries, although they might recognize their common interest and therefore limit the destructiveness of war, did fight against one another, and the victor always plundered the vanquished. In our own day, they are not fighting against one another at all. The war is waged by each ruling group against its own subjects, and the object of the war is not to make or prevent conquests of territory, but to keep the structure of society intact." End quote. And now perhaps we are able, ladies and gentlemen, to solve the Red China riddle. Why would the United States, which according to Orwell would be called Oceania, after having built the Soviet Union, called Eurasia, having built the Soviet Union into a credible military foe, now embark on the same course on behalf of Red China, Eastasia? Orwell solves the riddle. To divide the world into three hostile totalitarian states which will be forever at war with each other, to provide the existence of a supposed external threat, to motivate loyalty from their citizens, to justify totalitarian control, and thus to ensure that the three systems will remain stable, as they call it, that is, without internal dissent. To bring this up to date, let's take a look at something called the Report from Iron Mountain. This was a think tank study on alternate ways for a government to control its citizens, or in other words, to stabilize society, without war. They said, here we are at a time in history when it's possible that we could form a world government and through disarmament prevent war. Now, how can we control our citizens in the absence of war? And the conclusion of this think tank study was that there was no substitute for war. The report was commissioned in the fall of 1963 by an unnamed government agency. The evidence points quite clearly at the Defense Department under the personal direction of then Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. The report was not intended for public release, but fortunately a copy was leaked to the press by one of the members of the group that wrote it, and it was published for public consumption by Delta Books in 1967. It was clear from the later events that unfolded and became public that the report was prepared under a grant to the Hudson Institute. Now, that's a think tank located at Croton-on-Hudson in New York. It's located at the base of Iron Mountain. Now, Iron Mountain is interesting because it envelops a massive nuclear shelter for hundreds of large U.S. corporations. Now, most of these companies use the shelter for the storage of important documents, but several of them also maintain emergency corporate headquarters there. Such companies as Standard Oil, Manufacturers Hanover Trust, and Shell Oil maintain corporate headquarters inside that mountain. The question arose, is the report authentic? When it was published, the White House was quick to deny that it was authentic. The Washington Post called it a delightful satire, and so did Herman Kahn, who was director of the Hudson Institute. And so all of the right people said that it was a fraud. But on November 26, 1967, the report from Iron Mountain was reviewed in the same Washington Post by Herschel McLandris. Now, Herschel McLandris is a pseudonym for Harvard professor John Kenneth Galbraith. Now, Galbraith said that he knew firsthand of the report's authenticity because he had been invited to participate in it. Now, although he wasn't able to be part of the official group, he was consulted from time to time. And he also had been asked to keep the entire project secret. This is what Galbraith wrote, quote, "As I would put my personal repute behind the authenticity of this document, so would I testify to the validity of its conclusions. My reservations relate only to the wisdom of releasing it to an obviously unconditioned public." End quote. So you get the picture? He participated in this. He knows it's valid. He agrees with its conclusions. He just thinks that the public is too stupid to understand it. So now, what did this report really say? First of all, it stated that the authors agreed that morality could not be allowed as a factor in their deliberations. They threw out all questions of good and evil, whether life was good and death was bad, whether destruction was bad or anything. The only good which they could allow as a moral question in this study was the survival and stability of the government. Whatever caused society to be stable and to survive was good. Anything which caused it to disintegrate was bad. Then they said that war in the past had been the only means by which governments had been able to perpetuate themselves. And then they asked the question, is it possible now to find a substitute for war under the possibility of world government and disarmament? Under such conditions without war, what would the government do, they asked themselves. What could the government do to perpetuate itself? What are the possible alternatives to war? And they listed 5 of them, or at least 5 categories. Incredible as it may seem, the first one was blood games. As in ancient Rome, they said that there's a certain mass passion that the people express when they see blood and killing and pain and anguish and conflict. Let the people work these things out in blood games. Perhaps violent sports could be expanded to fill this role. A second possibility. How about a war against environmental pollution? Let's get everybody worried about the environment and a war against pollution. Raise that to the level of a war against a real physical enemy. And they said even if necessary, they would consider deliberately poisoning the environment to make the threat more credible. Third possibility. How about civilian work armies? Let's call poverty the enemy. We'll raise work armies to conquer poverty. And also they said it could serve a very important secondary purpose, and that is to discipline society's dissidents. If you don't like what's going on, you might be conscripted into a work army. And they described this in plain English, and these are their words, a modern, sophisticated form of slavery. That's their phrase. 4. How about the threat of invasion from outer space? Maybe that will do it. And they said that experiments with this may already have been tried. And 5th, they said if no perceptible threat is found to exist of sufficient magnitude, it will be necessary to invent one. The report concluded with these words, quote, "When asked how best to prepare for the advent of peace, we must first reply as strongly as we can that the war system cannot responsibly be allowed to disappear until 1, we know exactly what it is we plan to put in its place, and 2, we are certain beyond reasonable doubt that these substitute institutions will serve their purposes in terms of the survival and stability of society. It is uncertain at this time whether peace will ever be possible. It is far more questionable that it would be desirable even if it were demonstrably attainable." End quote. So there you have, ladies and gentlemen, the end of the pessimistic scenario. The future world would be nothing short of universal serfdom and perpetual war. And it could be in our lifetime. If it does become reality, then there will be no economic survival for any of us. Even those who manage to profit from making the right moves within the various investment markets, or perhaps I should say especially those people, will be in virtual chains. Now, will it happen? Well, it could. But as I said a moment ago, I think not. Remember, this is a survival seminar, which means that it is based on the assumption that we will not become modern serfs. Now, it's true that the further we travel towards serfdom, the more difficult and painful will be the turnaround. So the question is, if the optimistic scenario is too optimistic and the pessimistic scenario is too pessimistic, then what is the scenario for survival? And is it, in fact, a realistic one? A realistic scenario for the future. Now, that does not mean that it is a likely scenario, because I don't think it is. But it is realistic in the sense that it is possible. It's important to get this distinction. It is going to require a gigantic effort on the part of everyone in this room. But considering the alternative, we should all be thankful that at least we have the possibility to survive in freedom. Now, education, quite frankly, is the key. The outcome depends not so much on making the right moves in the various investment markets, but on how successful we are in the battle for men's minds. We must save the system, or all else is a gigantic waste of time. Unless the American people understand the nature of a central bank, the operation of the Mandrake mechanism, and the fraud of fiat money, they will not insist upon the reforms needed for survival, nor will they be able to withstand the propaganda in times of economic crisis to say no to the consolidation of totalitarian power. The key to survival is an educational campaign to inform the electorate while there still is time. Now, what will an informed electorate demand? First of all, they will demand that we let the corrupt banks fall. When the bad loans are written off, all of the large money center banks will be recognized as bankrupt just by looking at their financial statements. These losses are real, and they must be taken by someone, as we've said several times. By following the principle of laissez-faire, losses will be taken by those who deserve to take them. Who are they? The owners of the banks, who are responsible for the bank's operating policy, and the depositors, who have not taken the trouble to inform themselves about their bank's solvency. Owners of the banks will be wiped out. It's estimated that total write-offs will run between $200 and $300 billion. The net worth of these banks is approximately $150 billion, which will be liquidated to partially satisfy the bank's creditors, including the depositors. After this, the losses that must be absorbed by the depositors themselves will be approximately $50 to $150 billion. Now, this will be reduced slightly by the amount of money that truly is available in the FDIC and the FSLIC. The net loss to the depositors, therefore, will actually be quite modest, estimated at between 10% to 20% of their deposits. Note, however, that not all depositors will fare equally. Those in small regional banks with conservative investment portfolios may lose little or nothing, while those in the large banks could lose 75% to 90% of their deposits. Now, the next thing that the informed electorate will demand is to let the inefficient corporations fall also. You see, many of the largest corporations have become quite inefficient. They survive today only because of government protection and subsidy, plus favorable credit policies extended by the banking interests that control them. The British financial weekly, The Economist, published a study showing that a dollar spent for research and development by a small company produces 24 times as much revenue as a dollar spent by a corporate giant. Almost all new jobs currently are being created by small or medium-sized companies. There has been no increase in employment by the nation's top 500 companies since 1977. Government subsidy of inefficient companies, and I might add of inefficient labor. This subsidy is largely responsible for America's loss of industrial leadership in the world. These companies are a drain on the economy, and they must be allowed to fall to make way for new and more efficient enterprises. In the short run, the results will be painful for most people. Let's face it. Factories will close. There will be high unemployment. The money supply will contract sharply, resulting in falling prices of both goods and labor. That means falling wages as well. Those who are purchasing property on credit will find that its new value could be less than what they owe on it. The stock market will drop, and paper fortunes will disappear back into the inkwell from which they came in the first place. Lifestyles will be lowered, and there will be widespread hardship. As bad as these conditions may be, ladies and gentlemen, we should hope and pray that they do come to pass. Because if they do not, that means that the cabal has finally consolidated total control over the economy and our lives, that the operation of the free market has been completely replaced by totalitarian directives which simply forbid economic disruptions by edict. Remember, there's no inflation or unemployment or poverty in the Soviet Union or Red China because the government says there isn't, regardless of how awful the conditions are. And if you publicly disagree, you will soon be convinced to do otherwise. If we do not experience the pain of adjustment back to a free and honest monetary system, we shall suffer the far greater pain of living under the heel of totalitarianism. There's an apparent contradiction here. Earlier I said that I didn't think the needed reforms were going to be made in time to avert a major crisis. Now I'm saying that with a sufficiently energetic educational effort, the electorate will in fact demand most, if not all, of those reforms. Now both are correct, but note that the key issue here is when these reforms are going to be made. I'm saying that they will not be made in time to avert a monetary crisis, but they can be made in time to avert slipping into totalitarianism. And this distinction is crucial to an understanding of our very difficult job that lies ahead. A lot of people want to know, when will the crisis occur? When is it coming? What is the date? And it reminds me of the story told to me by a friend who was raised in the northern part of the Midwest in the Farm Belt. And he told how every fall his father would chop the wood and put it away, repair the roof on the barn, and make sure that the windows of the house were sealed. His mother would put away the food goods, and they would get ready for the winter, and they would prepare for the storm. They knew the storm was coming. They didn't worry about the date. It was enough to know that it was coming. And when it did come, they were ready. I think we need to take that attitude in preparing for the economic storm that lies ahead. We need to begin our preparations immediately, without worrying over the exact date of the crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, the date is not important. The fact is the storm is coming, and we had better get ready for it. So where do we start? All of this is very theoretical so far. Let's get down to specific suggestions regarding what each one of us can do now to prepare for the economic storm. Now, what follows is a distillation of the opinions and wisdom of many economists, particularly of the Austrian school. These are men who have written on the subject and have talked on it, and very little of it is original with me. I have added my own concepts, a few here and a few there, but primarily of organization and the addition of specific worksheets and formulas, which I hope will make the process easier to understand and to apply. Now, we are going to approach the financial plan at two different levels. We're going to talk about general concepts and then, secondly, formulas and worksheets. As far as general concepts are concerned, I will suggest first a strategical overview of your plan, then the establishing of separate funds for specific purposes, and third, the analysis of the categories and types of investments that would be well suited for those funds. And then I will provide worksheets for the calculation of the value of your assets and your investable income and the allocation of these to the various funds. Now, a sample worksheet is included in the syllabus as a guide, but there's also a blank sheet at the back of the syllabus which you can use at home. I would suggest that when you are filling in your own numbers that you keep the blank sheet as an original and make photocopies, because you undoubtedly will want to change these figures from time to time. I'd like to point out that we will discuss categories of investments and the pros and cons of types of investments within those categories. But when it comes to an analysis of the specific options within each of those types, that, frankly, is beyond the scope of this seminar. It's long enough as it is. In other words, we will discuss, for example, investments for income, and we will analyze the pros and cons of blue-chip stocks and commercial real estate as income producers in times of crisis. But we will not be telling you to buy IT&T or dump your real estate investment trust. In these choices, especially with regard to their tax consequences in your unique situation, you should seek the services of a professional financial planner, someone who not only is a specialist in his field, but who is able to sit down with you and devote extensive time to analyzing your personal situation. It is our intent, however, with these funds and formulas to get you at least halfway to your objective, so that when you sit down with your analyst, you will be ready for him and you can tell him what you want rather than depend totally upon his overview of what lies ahead. So let's take a look at the plan. Actually, there are 5 steps in the successful formulation of any financial plan. First, you must take an inventory of your present assets. Then you must determine what portion of your current income can be set aside for conversion into future assets. Then you must identify your specific investment objectives. Fourth, you must develop a formula for applying your assets and investable income to the achievement of those objectives. And fifth, which of course is the most important step, you must implement the formula. In other words, don't just plan it, actually do it. You have no idea how many people will take the first 4 steps, but when it gets around to actually doing something about it, the plan stays in the drawer, which is of very little help to them. So what about taking inventory? The best way to show the value of your assets is to construct a statement of net worth, as it's called, which is essentially the same as the traditional balance sheet that's used in the financial statement of any business firm. Now, there's no absolute format for this. So long as it shows both assets and liabilities, net worth can be calculated as the difference between the two. And I have shown in the syllabus a sample statement of net worth. You can look at that later at your leisure. I believe you'll find it quite self-explanatory. Now, we turn to the necessity of gathering information together on index cards. Now, if you're a computer whiz, you can find ways to do this on computer, but I'm assuming that we're not going to use computers, so we'll use the manual method, and it's probably the better method for most people anyway. In order to make entries in the statement of net worth, you have to have the data for each item, and it must be kept up to date. And the best way to do that is to make an index card or sheet of paper for each asset, or in some cases groups of assets, with a space for periodical updates. And again, in the syllabus, you will see samples of these asset records. You'll notice right away that a certain amount of time is going to be required for this process. You're going to have to sit down and spend a little time each week and each month, and we haven't even come to the formulas and the calculations yet. But there's just no way around this. Actually, it's not as bad as it seems at first, especially after you get the system up and going. A little more time is required to get your cards worked up, but after that, it's really not so bad. It won't even take as much time as most people spend reading the paper or watching the evening news. And frankly, in my opinion, this is much more important. In fact, after a while, you'll even find that it becomes fun to monitor your portfolio and watch the figures change. And we hope they change upward, and not downward. But watch the figures change and to really know what your estate is worth. It can become a very exciting and rewarding pastime. Well, the next step in preparing your financial plan is to analyze your current income and to determine how much of it can be set aside for conversion into additional assets. In other words, how much of your earnings is left over after your living expenses. Of course, there are many who will say that that's the problem. There's nothing left over. But in truth, we all find the money for the things we really want. It's a question only of priorities. As I said earlier, we must reset our priorities, and first things have to be put first. We must remind ourselves how important survival really is compared to other demands for our spendable dollars. It's the assumption of this seminar that each of us have at least some portion of our current income that can be applied to an investment for the future. And we shall call this investable income. We'll look in your syllabus on page Roman 11.9. You will find the formula which I suggest for determining the investable income. Please note the line there on monthly support of voter education. I'll be talking more about that at the very close of the seminar, but I want to emphasize now that if you do not intend to invest in informing your fellow Americans, you do not have the picture. You do not have a serious investment plan for the future, because frankly, without that, there will be no future. Now, the next step in the development of your financial plan is to identify your investment objectives. Now, there are many ways of approaching investment objectives, but I have chosen to identify those objectives which I believe can be applied to all persons and over most of their lifespan, and regardless of their marital or parental status. Objectives which are so broad that if we can accomplish them, our smaller objectives will fall into place. Let's identify those and establish separate funds designed to accomplish each of them. And I see 5 different investment objectives and 5 different funds. Number 1, we want to be able to handle the payment of routine living expenses in a convenient and efficient manner. For this, we shall establish the operating fund. 2, we want to have money for expenses that we know are coming in the future, such as the education of our children, the replacement of furniture and appliances, home repairs, the acquisition of new consumer goods, auto replacement, vacations, non-insured medical bills, and predictable emergencies. This is investment for deferred spending, and for this we shall establish the savings fund. 3, we want to have income in addition to our wages so we can improve our present standard of living and also provide a cushion for retirement when wages stop altogether. For this, we shall establish the income fund. 4, we want to have the good fortune to become truly wealthy and to create a substantial estate to pass on to our children or to a worthy cause. This objective is difficult to attain unless one is earning an impressive salary and can accumulate wealth simply through sheer earning power. The only other way to accomplish this objective is through high-risk investment. For the hardy ones who are determined to travel this road, we shall need the speculation fund. If you prefer to call it the estate fund, I have no objection to that, but let's not forget the identity of it. In essence, it is really a speculation fund. And 5, we want to protect ourselves from losing everything through hyperinflation and collapse of the monetary system. And for this, we shall establish the protection fund. Now let's take a close look at each of these funds and see what kinds of investments are best suited to them. Take the operating fund first. The first thing to notice is that this fund is not for investment or to make money. It's purely for the convenient payment of bills through the mail or by telephone. Checking accounts with banks or savings and loans are okay for this purpose. Now remember, generally not the larger banks and not the older savings and loans, which have their investments tied up in questionable real estate values. I'd like to point out that at the back of the syllabus, we have a list of the banks and the savings and loan associations which are the strongest and the weakest. I would suggest you consult that list carefully, and if you find that your bank or savings and loan in which you are interested is not on the list, I have also shown the names and addresses of various reporting agencies which can give you a detailed analysis of any financial institution in America. The prices are reasonable. What you need to do is to check their loan-to-asset ratios, and particularly their ratio of loans to foreign countries, or their ratio of mortgages issued in the 1970s, if such information is available, and generally it is. Now, for convenience of payment, credit cards are okay, but I do not recommend that you use credit cards for borrowing. If you find that debt is absolutely necessary, then interest rates generally are lower from other sources. And many people, of course, will wish to use no checking accounts at all. An alternate approach is not to have these accounts, but to use cash to purchase money orders or cashier's checks as needed. This, of course, is not as convenient, but it is far safer and provides greater privacy. All right, the protection fund. This fund is not for investment either. Now, this is very difficult for some people to understand. They want to know, how much money am I going to make if I invest in gold or silver or something like that? And if I'm not going to make money, or if I didn't make money the last 3 years or the last year, then I wasn't successful in my objective. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a protection fund. You do not expect to make a profit on your health insurance premiums. You spend that money out each month and each year, and you never expect to have it back, and you hope that you never get any of it back through a claim. The purpose is insurance. You don't rejoice when you receive payment on a large health claim, even if the amount exceeds the cost of your premiums, because that means you've suffered a grave illness or injury. You're lying in a hospital bed. And by the same token, we should not rejoice if the price of gold goes up, because the apparent profit is merely a mirage. It's a sign of the destruction of the purchasing power of our money supply. With that, the value of our savings and our insurance and many other things that we have will be going down. Now, the price of insurance goes up as the likelihood of the event being insured against increases. The cost of life insurance to a 95-year-old man is very high, but it is fair. The closer we draw to the event of economic collapse, the greater will be the demand for tangible assets, such as gold or silver, to replace paper money, and the higher will be the price of such assets. Generally speaking, the price is always correct because it reflects the probability and thus the value of the asset's utility. That's merely the free market at work. So in reality, ladies and gentlemen, we don't need to worry so much about the price. The price is always correct. Daily or even monthly fluctuations in the price of gold or silver are not important. It is only the long-term trend that counts. Assuming there are no unusual political factors placing unnatural stresses on the supply or demand, then any time is the right time to buy. And as we draw closer to the monetary abyss, the cost of protection will rise sharply. And so the sooner the insurance is purchased, the less expensive it will be. Now, you can take a look at the chart there in the syllabus for a review of what I consider to be suitable investments for the protection fund. I'd like to call your attention particularly to the second line, which is food and other consumable necessities. A most important point that many people overlook, the subject of food. At the back of the syllabus, I have enclosed a food report, which will give you the result of my study on this issue. I think everyone ought to have at least a 6-month supply of food for their family, even if you don't follow the pessimistic scenario. You know, having a food supply is a good idea. You never know when you're going to be thrown out of work. You never know when you'll be ill and lose work because of illness. And I think we all have an obligation in our productive years to put aside those things that are necessary so that in times of adversity we don't have to fall back on the charity of our friends or society. But even beyond that, ladies and gentlemen, I think when you look realistically at the world around you, the possibility of having to use a food supply is exceedingly high. And I think it's an excellent investment. You know, you may put away a large amount of money, and then when the grocery stores suddenly don't have any food in them, and we've seen that happen to a small degree, even with a truckers' strike or the threat of a hurricane or something like that, and that's nothing compared to what could happen to the grocery stores in the event of a major crisis. But we put away our money, and we think that we're going to be able to buy food with it, but you know, no matter how much money we have, if there's no food in the grocery stores, your money is of no value whatsoever. Whereas those who have food put aside will always be able to exchange it for money. And so in a very real sense, I say that in times of crisis, food can be more valuable than gold. Well, then we turn to the savings fund. Now, that fund has to produce a return on investment equal to inflation or slightly higher, but probably not much higher because it must be secure. Now, the savings fund doesn't have to be as safe as the protection fund, but it needs to be as safe as possible, consistent with the requirement for at least a modicum of interest or growth in capital value to keep up with inflation. Now, since the purpose of the fund is to provide money for future spending, at least some of it has to be highly liquid. And this liquidity, too, will be a factor in determining a relatively low yield. But that's the price you have to pay for safety and liquidity. Now, it's important to know that the items in this fund should not be used as collateral for debt. These have to be free and clear. Remember, this is for deferred spending. These are items you are going to need in the future. Now, you can make a decision that, well, half of it I'll put up for the future. Maybe my fund has been a little fat when I set it up. Maybe I don't really need all that. These are decisions you will have to make. But I recommend that if you have analyzed your needs for the savings fund correctly and haven't made it too large, then it would be to your advantage not to encumber that fund with debt. Now, if you have overfulfilled that fund, then the amount which you have in it, which is over your formula, you may want to consider as collateral for other investments. There's one correction I would like to make. If you have a syllabus which shows money market funds down under the more cautious investments, I would like you to add that to item number 3, or line number 3 under suitable investments. If you make this proviso, money market funds which are 100% in treasury bills, I consider to be very suitable for this kind of an investment. But if the money market funds are in other kinds of short-term securities, including repos and that kind of thing, they're definitely down in the second section under more cautious investments. It depends on where those money market funds are invested. And I think that chart is self-explanatory. Now, income fund. Now, this fund has to produce a return on investment in terms of current income or growth in equity, which is substantially higher than inflation, because you need income from this, real income, not just mirage income. Your real income is the difference between inflation and the interest growth. A rate of 2 times inflation, I think, is not a bad formula to use as a guide. Higher rates usually carry substantially higher risks, and I think they would probably be better suited for the speculation fund. Remember, the higher the yield, the greater the risk. Now, this fund may be used as collateral for debt. Leverage is quite acceptable here, but I would like to advise you, please don't become emotionally attached to your holdings in this fund, because it is quite possible in the scenario that lies ahead that you could lose these assets. The objective here is positive cash flow. It is income, not ownership. And again, I think you will find the suggested suitable investments self-explanatory, so let's move on then to the speculation fund. Now remember that we're talking about gaining quite a bit of money here, building a substantial estate through good fortune and some knowledge, but let's face it, a great deal of good fortune is at work here, and that means, of course, a great deal of risk. That means that this is not for everyone. You have to expect to lose everything in this fund. I didn't say be prepared to lose it, I said expect to lose it. It's quite an important difference there. Expect to lose everything in this fund. If you are not psychologically suited to high risk, please do not participate in speculative investments. I would suggest then that you put all of your money into the income fund and stop there. There's enough speculation even in that fund to satisfy most people. Now, debt is preferred for this, actually. I think you should use as much leverage as possible. That is called using OPM, or other people's money. Go into hog. Get as deeply in debt as you can, but remember, do not incur liabilities or claims against your other assets which are held in your savings fund especially. And finally, I would suggest that don't hang on too long. If you make a profit, take it. Don't wait until it peaks out, because no one really knows when you've hit the top of the market. And the biggest problem I have seen with people losing money with speculative investments is that they hang on too long. When you make a profit, sell it, get out of the market, and don't wait for the top. Take your profits and move on to the next investment. And finally, perhaps the best investment advice I can give you in this category is that a high degree of professionalism really is required. You know, your chances are slim anyway in the investment field
You're out there with a bunch of sharks and barracudas and professionals who work at this full time. They know every small aspect of the market, and you really don't stand much of a chance unless you too become relatively expert in your chosen investment field. So my suggestion is, if you're going to play the options market, or if you're going into silver and gold mining stocks or penny stocks or any of undeveloped real estate or venture capital or any of the things that I've talked about there, you had better be prepared to spend some time studying it. Now, if you do study it and you do feel that you become knowledgeable in those fields, then you do stand a chance, of course, of being competitive. But if you think you can just turn it over to someone else to make a decision for you, I think you're making a mistake. Now, what are the optimum values of these funds? I'd like to start off by saying that the formulas which I have offered there are obviously optional. It may appear to be complicated at first, and it may scare some people away, but it's not as complicated as it appears. Don't let the math discourage you. It's actually simple, and it can be done on your pocket calculator. Also, this isn't the only way to do the job. You may find that you'll want to alter this approach to suit your own needs, but the purpose of laying down these formulas here is because the basic concepts will remain the same. This is a mathematically precise way of arriving at the critical figures. It has a self-disciplining effect that is valuable in keeping us on the investment track once we get started. But for those of you who wish to fly by the seat of your pants and forget the formulas and just say, well, I got a feeling for this and a little bit of that, if you like to do your financial planning like a good cook in the kitchen, a little bit of this, a little dash of that, you'll be able to forget the formulas altogether and just rely on your best day-to-day judgments. I guess it's not necessary to go over these formulas here at the seminar. They are self-explanatory. I've given you a sample to follow to see how a hypothetical person would arrive at their optimum values for those various funds. The only caveat I might offer at this point is to say that once you have established the optimum value or sizes of your funds and also have completed compiling your index card records, you will come then face to face with reality. In all likelihood, your actual portfolio that really exists today will bear very little resemblance to your plan. And you must be willing to convert your assets into the proper categories. And you should do it as quickly as possible. There's no point in having a plan if you don't follow it. We have a couple of things to wrap up before we leave. There are a few questions that came into me that I thought you might be interested in answering very quickly. Somebody asked, how can we profit from the coming change of U.S. currency? My answer to that is you cannot if you have any of it. In other words, that's the whole reason for changing it, is to conceal the fact that the currency is becoming more and more worthless. So people who are holding on to currency or money in any form are going to be hurt, not by the change in the currency necessarily, but by the events that bring on the change in the currency. So the answer to that is you cannot profit from that except to get rid of that money and money-related investments as soon as possible. You want to be ahead of the crowd rather than at the tail end. Somebody asked, when the central bank creates money out of nothing, then loans it to the government and charges interest on it, what happens to all that interest? That's a very good question. It used to be historically that the central bank simply used the interest and lived off of it. Today, the mechanism is a lot more sophisticated than that. Actually, the Federal Reserve System returns back to the Treasury all of the interest which it earned on that national debt, which it did not need to operate the Federal Reserve System. Got that? So in other words, the taxpayer is running their deal for them, paying the total cost of operating the Federal Reserve System, which is their theft mechanism. It's all paid for out of taxes, and you can imagine what's buried in there, because those expenses are never audited and never have been, and it's illegal right now to audit them. So so who knows what's buried in there, but some money is actually turned back to the Treasury, and the point I want to make on that is that the profit that is being made by these members of the cabal is not anymore just limited to the interest on that money created out of nothing. The real action is what was demonstrated by Nathan Rothschild at the bond market in London. That is knowing in advance what the market is going to do. If you could read next week's Wall Street Journal, you wouldn't have any problems. These people not only read next week's Wall Street Journal, they write it. And so that's all you really need, and the profits, the potential profits from that kind of inside information and control are absolutely staggering. Now, my closing remarks will take exactly 6 minutes, okay? I'd like to summarize and conclude the lesson and the message of this seminar. The American people have been subject to a quiet conquest by an invisible cabal using the secret science of money. We are now poised, in my opinion, on a repeat of the great duck dinner of 1929. Only this time, in my opinion again, it has to be much worse. People who had money in 1929 survived the Depression quite well. As a matter of fact, money was king. That's because their money was worth something. It was still backed by gold. This time around, the money supply is absolutely worthless. Although we are facing a similar crisis, this time we are facing a collapse of the monetary system in addition to the destruction of confidence and the flow of money. And it is my opinion that those who have a lot of money this time around will be the worst hit, and as I said in the brochure, those who have the most money at this time will jump from the highest buildings. The ultimate solution to the nation's economic problems is to allow the natural laws to reassert themselves and to restore reality in the marketplace, particularly in the marketplace of money. It'll be painful, it'll be very painful, but in the end we will recover. Just as the alcoholic recovers from the binge and from his addiction, he doesn't like the drying out process, but once it's done, he can recover and go back and lead a normal life. As a nation, we can recover after the dry out, but we can't avoid the dry out. We've gone too far for that. But then, believe me, ladies and gentlemen, we can climb to new heights of prosperity and freedom, the likes of which we have never seen before. We can survive, we can even prosper from the coming storm by prudent action, but not unless we succeed in restoring the system. We must restore the system. And so the educational imperative that we face cannot be ignored. It must be the central part of any plan for survival. We must wage and we must win the war against ignorance. I'd like to ask you a rhetorical question. What is the point of trying to make the right decisions in the money markets if all your gains are going to be lost anyway? Why bother trying to preserve your assets only to have them confiscated by the state? And why bother trying to create personal wealth if by doing so you are merely setting yourself up as a target to be destroyed by envious mobs, whipped to frenzy by totalitarian demagogues? Have I exaggerated? I don't think so. Reflecting upon these all too real possibilities leads to an inescapable conclusion. We must restore the system of sound money and limited government before we can even dream of financial security. Now, the key to survival, therefore, is an enlightened electorate. If we are serious about economic survival, we'd better become equally serious about a massive educational program to reach the voting public. Now, the movement of popular sentiment at the present time is all in the wrong direction. And as long as that condition exists, Congress will continue to follow the present road to disaster. The key to survival is an enlightened electorate. Without that, everything else is a colossal waste of time. Because without that, my friends, we're all headed for what Orwell envisioned so clearly, a world of modern serfdom and perpetual war. So how do we get the message out? It's an ancient proverb that the longest journey begins with but a single step. And there's no better first step you can take than to acquire the right informational tools to make your job easier along the way. One of these is the audio cassette version of this seminar, which of course needs no further explanation to those of you who have just suffered through it. All I can add is that if you have not already done so, you should acquire one or several sets of these tapes to circulate among your friends. This requires relatively little effort on your part, and the cumulative effect of such continuing action can be extremely powerful. For example, if every person who attends this seminar or who hears it by tape would take it upon himself to make sure that each week just one new household was loaned a set of these tapes, then those who heard them in turn did the same, we could blanket the entire population of the United States in less than 2 months. Of course, that isn't going to happen because many people will not understand the message or take their part seriously. But ladies and gentlemen, even if only 15% respond to the challenge, 15%, now that's reasonable, we then could reach the majority of the voting population in less than a year. And that's all we really have to do, because when that happens, there will be a groundswell of public opinion, and Congress simply will have no choice but to respond. Even the worst of the politicians will not dare cross so many constituents. So it can be done, but the key is to keep those tapes moving. It will do no good to hide them in a drawer. Remember, one new household every week is the goal. I'd like to conclude with the story of the chicken and the pig who were talking behind the barn one day, and the subject came up about the difference between being involved and being committed. And the chicken said, well, yes, I know what you mean. Let's take the subject of ham and eggs, for example. Now, in a breakfast of that kind, said the chicken, I am really involved. And the pig grunted and he said, yes, you may be involved, but sister, I'm committed. So my advice to you, ladies and gentlemen, is become involved now while you can. Later on, you may find that you are committed to this crusade, whether you like it or not. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for coming to this seminar. You have been extremely patient and attentive. I hope that what you have learned will help you to become prosperous, and I especially hope that I have convinced you to join the team for a gigantic educational crusade to return prosperity and freedom to America. Thank you.